Now, when you look at my collection or anybody else's collection, you might consider the Titans Returns Fortress Maximus, or even the Titans Returns Metroplex, as two of the biggest Transformers ever conceived. And that would probably be true. However, there was one giant robot that was actually sold way before Hasbro decided to go down the Titans line. And that robot was Unicron. And I'm not talking about the 1986 prototype that we heard about, or the one that's currently in development that will tie into the Titans Returns eventually. No. I'm talking about the one that came out during the era of Energon and Armada and Cybertron and Universe, around that tail end. And I will say that basically what a lot of people are getting right now, the Studio Series, whatever it's called, yeah, it's bigger than this one. But at the time this was released, this was considered the biggest at that time. It was. It was considered the second biggest they ever did. Now you might say, well, what about the original Metroplex? That's an argument to be made, but this is considered at the time when it was released around 2006, 2007 as the biggest. Now, this thing is big to the point that as the tripod here, or the mic stand that's substituting as a tripod will attest to, this thing is so big that basically the length of this stand can't go down just enough for you to properly see it. You have to see it like this. And this thing is huge. Now you might say, well, how big is it, Brian? Well, for a comparison, I'll show you. All right, hopefully you guys can see this, but as a size comparison, take a look at Unicron. I think this is from Energon, I believe, or the Cybertron one. Compare him to the size of Titans Returns Fortress Maximus, and you can pretty much tell that not only is Fortress Maximus bigger, obviously, but you can see how big Unicron is to Fort. Fortress Maximus is about, what, 3 feet? About 3.5 feet? Just as big as the Titans Returns Metroplex. So you compare him to Unicron. Unicron is basically half a foot smaller than him. And this is the Unicron, and Unicron at the time, when it was released, was considered the second biggest one compared to the original Fortress Maximus. So why do I bring this up, you might ask? Because can you imagine how big the Titans Returns Unicron is going to be? I mean, we think, Fort Max and Metroplex are big. And the Cybertron Energon release of Unicron is big. Just imagine how big Titans Returns Unicron is going to be. We're looking at probably an over 3 feet, near 4 feet scale figure. I think that's what Hasbro described it as. A nearly 3 feet, or nearly over 3 feet, 4 feet figure. Now, I know obviously it got made. I don't know who has it yet. But one comparison or similarity people might be bringing out is that new studio one that people have been talking about. That's kind of a substitute for what we will get in the future officially by Hasbro. But again, when you take a look at the size comparison between the two, obviously, it shows you that before Hasbro came out with the Titans Returns line, Unicron was the second biggest one compared to the original Fort Max release. Now, obviously, you put him in scale with even, let's say, the Power of the Primes Rodimus, which is basically Hot Rod and Rodimus combined. It's basically two robots in one, if you will. He's still bigger than the average Power of the Primes Leader class, I think it was his Leader class figure of Rodimus Prime Hot Rod. He's bigger. And that's saying something. That is saying something. And, you know, when you have a figure that came out years ago, over a decade and a half ago almost a decade and a half, being bigger than even some of your newer figures, that shows you, or kind of gives you an idea of how big that Hasbro version is going to be when it comes out. Another way to compare sizes is this is the talking Princess Twilight Sparkle figure that they brought out for the movie. This is considered almost like, you know, a Titan's Return like figure. This is almost the MLP version of a Titan's Return like figure. Excuse me there, when it was released. But look at her compared in size. If it wasn't for the horn, if you will, if you compare her in size, if it wasn't for the horn, she's basically the same size as Unicron. The same size. So again, I'm doing this because when you compare the size of one of the original releases back during the Energon Cybertron universe era, it makes you really think, oh wow, how big could that new one be? How big and gigantic is that new one going to be? I mean, again, everybody talks about that other one that's out, that Studios one, which is actually affordable. But when you compare that Studios one to a potential official Hasbro release, again, you have to look at an official release by Hasbro of this figure from the Energon to Universe line, and you'll kind of get an idea of, oh my gosh, that thing's going to be huge. It is. And again, in comparison to the Talking Princess Twilight Sparkle, the fact that she's, with the exception of the horn, which makes it just about an inch or two taller, you know, she's practically the same size. Again, it really makes you think. Another comparison, if you will, is this is the 20th anniversary edition of Optimus Prime for the 20th anniversary edition of the movie, the animated movie, that is, from 2006-2007. And you look at this, Prime is almost, just by maybe 2 inches, 3 inches, about 5 inches short maybe, or maybe even a foot short than the Unicron figure that was released around the same time. And even if you add the stand, he's still smaller. He's still smaller. So again, it really makes you think and speculate how enormous, you know, that Titans Returns Unicron figure is going to be when it's released. It really makes you think that, because, you know, honestly, you know, again, when you saw him side by side with Titans Returns Fortress Maximus, you know, Fort's big. So is Metroplex, the Titans Returns ones. But when you put him in scale to figures that came out after it, like the Powers of the Prime Rodimus Hot Rod, and you compare him to the Talking Twilight Sparkle, and now even to the 20th anniversary edition of Optimus Prime that came out in time for the 20th anniversary edition of the animated movie, that really tells you how big that figure is going to be when you look at how enormous this was, this being at that time the second biggest, you know, alongside the original Fort Max. It really makes you think how big and speculate how big the new reversion is going to be. Heck, for another size comparison, here are some figures that came out, you know, afterwards or around the same time. This one came out around the same time, around that era, and you could definitely tell the size comparison, right? Look at that. He's small. He basically goes up to his ankle. But then, here's RC. This came out basically, like, what was it, a couple of years ago, several years ago? This came out. Look how big she is compared to this Unicron that came out between the Energon, Cybertron, Universe, Armada era. Look how big she is. And then compare Blur. This figure of Blur. See what I'm saying? Again, imagine how big that Titans Returns Titans Returns Unicron is going to be. And for one last comparison, here's a reissue of the original G1 of Ultra Magnus, the original G1. Take a look at how big he is. Take a look. Not even goes up to halfway to his first, only goes up with his things, goes up to his third spike just about on that arm. Again, pale in comparison to how big, oh, not pale in comparison, but imagine how bigger that Unicron one's going to be, the Titans Returns one, that Hasbro Pulse is working on and will be releasing limitedly and then worldwide, retail-wise, in the near future. Imagine how that big that sucker will be. And I'm sure a lot of people, again, are looking at the studio one that they got and saying, hey, it's going to be about this size. No, maybe, but from what Hasbro's describing, it's going to be a lot bigger. Most definitely. The point that I'm getting at when it comes to this guy is, again, when he was released around the Armada, Energon, Cybertron universe era of about 13 to 15 years ago, he was considered the second biggest Transformer that Hasbro ever created. And I remember getting him at the Walmart in Lawrence, Kansas, and he cost about $49, actually about $60, I think. $60 to $70 this guy cost, because he was the second biggest one they ever made. So again, imagine how big the newer version that's going to tie in with the Titans Returns line. You know, imagine how big that's going to be when it gets released. I mean, Octobotimus, Bolt Matrix, you know, Michael Mercy, Rodimus Primal, you know, Patriot Prime, Kato, Peg, or Perg, sorry if I pronounced that name wrong, Chris McFarlane, anybody that's a Transformers fan that collects and talks about them, you know, kind of knows what I'm talking about, kind of can get an idea of what I'm talking about when I'm doing, you know, while I'm doing this video, you know, they basically know what I'm talking about when it comes to basically, you know, these, you know, basically getting people ready, or at least, you know, speculate in the mind of how big the Titans Return of Unicron will be. I mean, you see that on my shelf, as I showed you at the beginning, on my shelf here, on my dresser here in my room, you know, just how big Ford is and how just I'm barely able to fit him up there to display. So can you imagine how big Unicron's going to be? I'm just saying, guys. I'm just saying. I'm getting you prepared for possibly the biggest display you're going to have if you can get your hands on the figure. I mean, right now I know a lot of people are substituting with or alternating and substituting with the studio one that's come out, the third party one, or whatever it's called. That's a great representation, don't get me wrong. I know they're waiting and biding their time with this, or with that. But I guarantee you, once Hasbro makes that thing available, not just limited, but fully retail-wise and everything, people are going to be cleaning, collectors, fans of Transformers are going to be cleaning out the space area, the shelf areas, you know, buying that, and basically when they get the money to buy that thing, they'll be buying it, taking it out of its packaging and displaying it for everybody to see. And it's going to take, I guarantee you, one shelf area. You will not be able to fit anything else. I guarantee that. So, anyway though, guys, I just thought I'd come on here and show you the first official Unicron figure that came out that was considered the second largest Transformer that they did back in the mid-2000s during the Armada all the way to Universe era. Thought I'd just let you guys see that and kind of, in a sense, compare the size of it when it comes to some of the past and current figures, including the Titans line, Titans Returns and Powers of the Prime, as well as Earthrise and all that. As well as kind of give you an idea, let you kind of speculate in your mind that if this was the second biggest, and even some of the figures out now dwarfed by this in a sense, can you imagine how big the Titans Returns Unicron will be when it's released? But that's all I can say, guys. Let me know what you all think down below. Comment if you like, and I will talk to y'all later.